Yeah. So, hi everyone. We're just chatting here with Sarah because Sarah has watched the conversation with Guru Viking and Dalson. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, yeah. Yeah, I was just
Dalson,
texting
does he have a
Maggie
last name? Does he have a
Armstrong, I think.
Dalson Armstrong? And unfortunately, I was only able to watch the statement he made, like the initial statement that tells us what the conversation is about, what the thing is about. And I said to Sarah that like I wish I actually had a chance to watch the whole conversation so we could chat about it probably in more detail because I just went through the timestamps just to see the themes that were discussed. I'm like, oh my God, this is also interesting. But I still would love to hear your like initial thoughts, having watched it.
Yeah, it's so funny. It just popped onto, I was actually uploading my own video and YouTube and it, it showed up on my feed as a video to watch. And I was like, oh wow, this is exactly what Maggie and I have been talking about for
Mm-hmm.
a series of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And for folks who may know Delson or may not, he's been on the Guru Viking podcast several times and has been in like the non-dual circles and just Buddhist, working with Buddhist practitioners for a while, and had declared that he had attained arhatship, which for folks who may be familiar with that, it's kind of like the highest attainment in
Mm-hmm.
the Buddhist system.
Mm-hmm.
And to be an arhat, there's a certain definition to that, which meant like he didn't have desires anymore. He didn't have reactions, emotional reactions, all of these things. And there's a beautiful, genuine quality to Delson that I felt was really like lovely and watching, his videos about that. And I think he has a lot of insights that were like really helpful for me in just understanding like um, what it looks like to still unfold in karma, even with maybe some of those things that shift and go away. But in this video, Delson kind of comes out uh, saying that he's relinquishing his attainments, that he like no longer wants to state his arhatship or his sense of not being reactive anymore. That over the course of the last, I don't know what the time period is, but he has felt reactions. He has felt emotions like anger, that he's felt all of these very human emotions that Maggie and I have been chatting about, especially the last few weeks. And also feeling desire, like sexual desire, things that
Mm-hmm.
of the body, of a much more like ancient human body that, like I think he just speaks to also the dangers of like pretending that we don't have these desires. So that like we've talked about when we suppress our emotions or suppress our desires, that's when things kind of come out sideways. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I just found like I was listening to this being like, wow, this is so amazing. Also coming from someone who, um, is probably one of the highest attainment folks in Buddhism, in the
Mm-hmm.
world and coming into their humanity and really owning that humanity is actually maybe the most primary orientation at this point. It's almost like post-Arahatship is humanness.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah, and I saw some comments and the reaction to it. I was really happy to see the reaction the video go because everybody was really speaking to s- seemed to be speaking. I just sort of flipped through the comments and it just said, everybody was like, thank you for your honesty and thank you for your vulnerability and thank you for, whatever. So that's just lovely. So I could kind of get the tone of what that conversation probably was like from like the way people responded. Um, gosh, I mean, there are just so many things I want to say about that because I think the one theme that I can and maybe we can speak to today is I think what we also have in common which I've heard him talk about, which is this certain monopoly on the knowledge of awakening, or exclusivity of certain teachings, or that just continues to create this vibe of specialness and exaltation around this whole thing that enlightenment is. And it's so interesting because I bought a course that I wanted to do for quite some time just to get an idea through Sounds True. I don't know if you're familiar, Sarah, with Sounds True. And they offered, with the purchase, they offered 1 month free, like a subscription to their platform. And obviously, the first thing I looked for, and the only thing I was really interested in, was hearing Adi Ashanti, because I haven't heard like about him or from him in quite some time. And he spoke exactly one of the things that stood out for me from the conversation that he had there was precisely speaking of that there's such a um that there's this vibe around enlightenment that is really just not helpful, which pictures it as, like I said, this exalted, almost unattainable thing that makes you to almost like a saint. And I know we've talked about it already, and I probably repeat myself, but I think it's honestly worth repeating, because I know for the fact, even with the people I'm seeing one-on-one, that there's still belief in that. So even though if they heard it, that it's not the case, there's still that perception that this is something so special and so rare and so sort of, exalted that, they might never get there, or, whatever that means. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think we've talked about this, yeah, so many times around like the reification of an identity, like really attaching to an identity as still like a signal or a sign that there's something underneath that identity that wants to be seen and known and loved and discovered, and that's not a problem in itself. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
create identities and we can live with those, but they're like, especially with spiritual identities, like Dalson talks about this too, is like if you're going to proclaim, that you don't desire sexually, you better be pretty sure that, like internally, that that's not something you're actually wrestling with. And if you're not, like, if there's something in you, maybe you're suppressing it, maybe you're unaware of it, then it's really important to look at those things. And he was kind of speaking to, he's like kind of opening up his definition of spiritual awakening to really include shadow work, or to looking at the
Mm-hmm.
shadow as almost primary, because it's like, because at any point, especially at these later stages, you can declare yourself clean and clear and free of anything. And then that's the most dangerous place, where then followers come and you manipulate them, you use them, you take their power, and all sorts of teachers do that. And so there's a great harm that can come from that, from like claiming things that aren't true about yourself, thinking that you're not human.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
But I also think, I mean, I don't know what you think about that, but I think some of the things we say in various times, in various stages in our life, are genuine and real for us at the time.
yeah,
You see
for
what I
sure.
mean?
Yeah.
So for example, let's say if I haven't experienced a particular thing for like 2 years or 3 years or something like
Yeah,
that, that's true for me. Like
totally.
I'm not like making this up. I'm not like saying that this means I arrived or something like that. It's just true for me. You know what I mean?
Um,
So I think that there's also a sort of a danger of like when someone says, well, that's actually not entirely true for me now, to dismiss this other experience completely. Well, but that experience was as true as it was at the time. It doesn't need dismissing. And that includes getting ahead of ourselves and thinking we arrived. And I'm just saying that there's also an innocence to that. We only share what we know at the time. And as we know, if anything, our experiences constantly evolve. There's something that's never changing, but there's something that's constantly evolving as well. And I think that it's completely normal. You don't have to be awakened or spiritual to know that, like, the way I perceived things when I was 18 was very different to when I perceived them in my 30s, and very different now that I'm in my 40s. So, I mean, there's just something completely normal with our experiencing changing and our perspective and seeing things differently. So yeah, I mean, because someone already suggested in the comments, implied, well, then he's probably not enlightened or at all, given what he just said. And I'm like, to me, it's like the opposite. Someone who says something like that probably kind of indicates more of the opposite. And someone responded to that comment saying, well, let's not throw the baby with the bathwater just because,
Mhm.
he said that. So yeah, talk to me what you hear in
Yeah,
this.
well, it's so interesting because this touches on so many things that we've
Hmm.
talked about over the last handful of weeks, right? Like
Yeah.
that literally, I think last week we talked about, like neither of us, we came into these difficult situations and we weren't triggered for the first
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
Felt like a new feeling of like experiencing that same emotion without the same reaction. But we
Yeah,
were saying like that doesn't mean that won't happen tomorrow, right? Like it
exactly.
doesn't. And to what you're saying, there's something about maybe just moving away. Oh, this is so funny. Moving
Yeah.
away from the linear. I literally, yes, last night I was driving to get gas, at night, and there was a car in front of me that had a license plate that said non-linear. And I was like,
That's
I was
so
gonna
funny.
like take a picture of it with my phone. I was like, this is dangerous. No, I shouldn't do that. But but I just, there's something about that. I was sitting with this message of nonlinear,
Hmm.
and I think it's exactly what you're saying too. It's like if we stop needing to track our linear progress,
Mm,
what if we're not growing into a more enlightened person?
mm,
Like, this whole thing too is about not being necessarily a separate person, but that what if like we are just living?
mm,
And what if, yeah, there is growth in certain areas of our life? We can track certain things that are changing. Like literally, plants grow, animals grow, we grow in certain ways. But what if some things are just happening in our lives? What if our life is just living us in some ways? And like that's why I love astrology too, is like sometimes we just see transits happening and they just express through our lives.
mm,
But there isn't necessarily a way we can like in a linear way, track the cause and effect of what happened necessarily, right? Sometimes just things pass through our lives, emotions pass through our bodies, things
hmm.
come up to be felt, or people come through our lives. Suddenly, there's no necessarily like a linear rhyme or reason or progress that we have to make. And maybe it's just, in a sense, it feels like a lot of conversations that I'm seeing around are just like maybe we're trying to a little bit lean more into the balance of out of that linear progress and trying to attain and trying to be something and just be a little bit more in the present of like
Just what is.
what
Yeah,
is,
as
as
it
you said,
is. Yeah,
as
people
it
going
is.
back to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that can mean all sorts of things. Yeah, like maybe, yeah, maybe you feel desire one day. Next week, you don't feel desire for 2 years. And then maybe you feel it again for like
Yeah.
10 years. And who knows? And it doesn't necessarily have to define who you are or what you've attained or what
Or does it
you.
have to mean anything? Like literally,
Yeah.
like it can just be what it is without attaching necessarily any meaning or even placing you on some kind of scale as to like it's not like I mean, at least the way I see it, it's not needed, which is why probably when I first came across the term like spiritual progress, I remember the first time I heard it, I felt it very jarring and I'm very uncomfortable with it because it felt like I couldn't even understand the concept within the stuff that we're talking about. Who's progressing in what exactly, you know? And there is no denying of the stages and various, because I mean, so many people have gone through various stages that they can totally identify and we can talk about it. So there's no point of denying that such things exist. But how often that word progress, when identified with, you know, it becomes this new identity and almost like a spiritual competition of some sort. Or you're here, I'm there, and here, there you go. The hierarchy is created, and there is, you know, you're here, I'm there, and then for I'm more special, more enlightened, or whatever. He spoke about, you know, I have to be honest, like I mean, I finished listening to him, and I was like, boy, like I have no regrets or anything like that, but am I glad that my journey unfolded without any tradition, without being part of any tradition of community? And again, I really don't mean it like I don't denounce anything, I don't bash traditions because I actually, there's part of me that really is fond of this stuff. Like there's a little
Yeah.
part of me maybe that like I could try being a monk for a while. Like it actually appeals to me, or like, you know, or be part of a tradition or do some rituals. Like why not? There's beauty to this thing as well, which I really recognize. But because of the stuff he talked about, it's almost like the politics of attainment. You know what I mean? I call it like a mini. I didn't receive any kind of approval from any ministry of attainment. You know, as to where I'm at. Um, I laugh when I say it, but it's true that it's like the when I hear from people who've been part of these things and almost like there's like a politics around it that feels like politics around it and almost like a spiritual snobbery of some type, which funnily enough to me is like an oxymoron, you know, talking about awakening and snobbery, or talking about awakening and exclusivity, talking about awakening and any kind of hierarchy. These two just don't freaking go together. You know what I mean? So, but like I said, I haven't had a lot of, I have not had any experience. So all I know about it is from people that I've been chatting to. But there is one thing that I can relate to, and I think that he felt clearly the pressure of that is our projections, our
Yes.
own projections of the spiritual teacher slash guru. So can you talk about
Yeah.
that?
Well, and I actually that was another part, I think, towards the end of the conversation. I also didn't catch the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of the conversation, so I might be missing some points. So
Mm-hmm.
forgive me, everyone who's listening, who's watched the
Mm-hmm.
whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But towards the end of the conversation, Dalson was speaking to what sounded like, and I may be wrong in seeing this, but it felt like a frustration, that Delson was experiencing around the projections that people
Mm-hmm.
have of his perfection, of his attainments, and not seeing him as a human being, like to project all of the things about seeing past lives or experiencing past lives or knowing about them. I'm not sure what his particular story around past lives was, but he brought up this thing about because
Did
he
he?
because he experienced something about past lives, people will come to him with like projections about, well, this is like what it means to be spiritual or to be spiritually attained. So I
Mm-hmm.
must kind of obsess about this particular thing
Right.
and then come to you with these questions, but not come with the devotion to actually, all of the more difficult things that one needs to kind of trudge through to get to some of the deeper shifts. And so he was speaking to, like, he was receiving all these students that he felt were not actually committed to the practices, to like actually going through things because they're attached to these ideas of what the attainments look like and what he looks like, as
Yeah.
opposed to being committed to their own personal journey,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
will look very different. Like what we've also talked about, that like he kept reiterating that everyone's path is unique. And he was also saying that, like, these traditions are really just cultural practices, in a sense that like they're from a certain time and a certain culture, and they may not apply to you, that some people may have a path of ayahuasca, or some people may have a path of Jungian psychology, and some
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he listed all these different ways, other than Buddhism, that
Totally.
are legitimate paths. And really, the question is just like, what is true for you, and how are you uncovering your
You can be
truth?
an entrepreneur. You can
Yeah,
be anything.
be literally just living your everyday life
Yeah.
and just be leaning into truth, like leaning into what is most true, like literally just telling the truth more, literally just being closer to what feels like that there's nothing between you and life. And so yeah, and talking about that, I think that there is something to that too, around spiritual teachers can't be liberated really to be free to be themselves, to be actually authentic, if there's all these projections, right? Because then everyone's projecting perfection, that you're going to be in this stagnant state of, you're this way all the time, you're never reactive, you don't desire, and all these things. And like we just talked about, that's just not how life works. I mean, there might be some people that are one way their whole life, and that's one expression of life. But for most folks, I think we have fluctuations throughout our day, throughout the hour, throughout, years, about maybe how things express, how our life takes shape.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and there's something about just like, can we let go of giving our power to these ideas of what spirituality is?
Mm.
There's there is something inspiring about seeing someone seemingly like attain something that helps maybe motivate. And I think that was something that Guru Viking, the host, brought up, was it's almost a little sad to lose like Delson Armstrong, the enlightened one, because
Mm-hmm.
because it was very inspiring for so many people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what if, when you go through, at least for me, like going through this shift of like the no self, it felt like, oh, this is so much more ordinary and so much more human and so much more grounded. And actually, we still reckon with the everyday humanness. What if we actually were sharing that more than we can actually expect, or like estimate a little bit better
Yeah.
what it looks like to make that shift, that it's
Mm.
not some perfection, it's not some yeah, special state. It's actually, just it's a quiet, very quiet and very ordinary thing, and very human. That the
Mm.
human is just even more clear. Um,
I mean, yeah, there's, oh God, I don't even know where to go with this because there's just so much in what you said. But some of the things that like stand out for me is that I honestly never had an issue, nor did I even understand why there was such a hoo-ha about Daniel Ingram or whoever, Frank, calling themselves Arahat. Like to me, like if that fits whatever there it is believed that Arahat is, then why not say it? Like what's the problem? And then if you got it wrong, then admit it that you got it wrong. That's fine too. It's like, but I just think that, and again, I am more than happy to be accused of like complete arrogance or ignorance about this, but maybe it's time to review the Arahatness, because something tells me when I read about what it means to be an Arahat, and I talk to people, I listen to people like Frank, or I talk to people like Daniel, it matches what it says. Like I think that they're genuinely what they say they are, like in that, or whatever their experience matches. Probably that is a better, their experience matches the description of what that means. But, and again, I might be wrong, but I think this arahatness, the way I learned about it, it just excludes a lot of this humanness. And I think this is why I like what you said before. It was like the post-Arahat. Let's talk about post-Arahatness. Let's talk about what it means moving forward. Let's talk to people who actually quote unquote attained it, not my favorite word either. And then let's see how their lives unfolded from there over, you know, yeah.
Well, I think in Buddhism, and this is where I am also ignorant, so but my sense from hearing a lot of Buddhist teachers and spending some time in Buddhist traditions and being initiated into one, is that there is a deep tradition of retreat, of
Mm-hmm.
like, and being in temples and in centers. And so culturally, if you had in the past attained arhatship or attained a certain level of enlightenment, you would be in a very contained space, probably, and living only certain ways and not being in certain relationships, not being in everyday
Yeah.
life. And because of that, those are the causes and conditions of like that will reveal only certain behaviors and certain reactions. And I think that's where today it feels like folks are just more interested, like Frank, um like Dalson. Dalson was saying like he realized he wants to have a family, he wants to have a partner, like that.
Oh.
In that, it reveals a different way. How this expresses is different, right? Because when you realize I want to be in everyday life, I don't want to just be a monk. I don't want to just be in a
Mm,
center. I don't just want to teach Buddhist
mm,
courses to people, but I want to live a more human, what we call more of an everyday human life.
yeah.
Then how this awakening expresses is going to be different. And so I think that's where like it's hard to admit that for certain folks that like maybe what we thought were the effects of this was because of the actual conditions
Mm-hmm.
of what that lifestyle was post-awakening. And what if those are just cultural conditions that were assumed to be unconditional? And this, I mean, we talked about the conditional and the unconditional, but it's like what I hear from folks who are going to these deeper stages too is like you start to realize how the conditional really is what makes everything. Like it
Mm.
is like the
Work. Yeah.
yeah, it's like
Function.
everything is all of these conditions, right? And that's why there are just some things that are just you cannot even imagine that are happening because these conditions are all coming together.
Mm,
And yeah, and I think just in that, actually, Delson talked about like the post, what he's seeing as like kind of the post arahatship, which is what we've talked about. It's so funny because this is so funny. It's independent, but it touches on so much of what we've talked about. Is the exchange of like, you know, you see the humanness in the isness, and the isness is in the humanness, like right.
totally. Yeah.
And that's what he was speaking to. Like that is the post. It's like that you are able to really be in human life and all of its um, maybe desires, preferences, like
Mm,
the anger, all the things that come up, and also know this, essence of this thing that's always been there, always been enlightened,
mm,
always been liberated.
mm.
And that these things are within each other. And we've talked about this a lot, that like that is the literal embodied experience of
Mm,
this shift, is
mm.
looking into things like you were saying when like you had your shift and you're looking at like the dish rag or that you're like cleaning the bathroom, right? And it's like you're literally seeing like the infinite like in that experience, right? And that,
Yeah.
yeah, same. And that's still to this day, that's what, if look at something and I look into it deeply, that's what I see, right?
Mm.
And and so these things can be in each other regardless of what's happening in our lives, and we can still live our lives. It's just a
Yeah.
more nuanced way of living. Yeah.
I just love I so love the fact that this whatever this is, expresses itself through different people in so many different ways. You know what I mean? I
Hmm.
actually I mean it would be so fucking boring. Sorry, but like it would be so boring if it was like everybody experiencing life the same way, or everybody being constantly like zenned out and unmoved. And then I personally actually find it boring on a kind of a strictly human level. But also I think that there is I think what's happening a lot of times, and I think he kind of um maybe not directly spoke to that in what I've heard him say, which is something that I've noticed happening a lot when people share their experiences, and then those experiences are being turned into a rule. I think
Yes.
that's or this is how it is. You know what I mean?
Yes.
As opposed to like, okay, Sarah has like sexual. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just giving an example. Okay, I'm like, let's say Sarah happens to have sexual desire, and there's like a whole path with that, and experience with that, and exploration of feminine energy, and blah blah blah. Maggie, zero sex drive for 2 years, no interest, total like hermit mode or something. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, that and without having to say, oh, that means to, oh, so enlightened person has to experience this, or it has to behave like this, it has to have this experience, it cannot have this experience anymore. And rather than seeing that there's multitude of these like various experiences and expressions, without having to package it, without having to turn it, like I said, into a rule that this is how it is. And I think that this is where um or even just saying, like according to what Arahatness means, I think I'm that. Like the way it is being described matches my experience. That's it. But who knows? Like this kind of open, leaving that question mark always, living that open thing to say, well, it might change, something might change tomorrow, something might be different. I don't know what it's gonna be like. And I think I really felt for him, to be honest, in one sense, because I can totally imagine a situation where you sit there and you have a bunch of people looking up to you. And whether it is conscious or not, I feel like there might be, no, I don't think every teacher will have that, but I can totally see on a very human level how you will feel the pressure to almost live up to what they see in you. And then having to maintain this, I mean, I can't imagine that. So, I wouldn't be surprised. So then, depending what that image is, you're going to be kind of withdrawing the bits about your experience that don't match it either. So then, this is how this whole project. So I totally recognize the projection of students because I've projected lots of stuff on certain teachers, and I'm so glad that I did, and that it was mirrored back, and it was incredibly teachable in and of itself, I must say. But I also recognize that certain teachers, knowingly or not, also manufacture a certain projection. And I underline knowingly or not, because it might not be conscious. By, for example, not sharing any intense parts of their experience or something like that. Sorry, I just kind of like rumbled for too long.
Uh,
So yeah.
no, what comes up for me with that is what is the function? What's the function of that projection? What's the
Mm,
function of being that teacher at the front of the room that's perfect? And as someone who's struggled with perfectionism, and again, I don't know like what tomorrow will bring around that theme for me, but I do know I've looked at this in myself and in others because it has been a struggle. And I think for all of us, because of it's a way that we can guard our shame and our guilt and
mm,
our desires, like
mhm,
to try to keep our desires at bay,
yeah.
is to try to be perfect instead. And I see the projections of that perfectionism, and Delson talked about this as, there's three things that a lot of like Buddhist practitioners that he met didn't really actually face, and that was like sex, money, and power. And then those three things would come out in sideways ways where people would be
Yep.
sexually abusive, it's like
Mm-hmm.
laundering money, or they're abusing and manipulating for power. And because we know these are very like deep-seated human ancient things that we struggle with,
Mm-hmm.
um, they're things to really look at. Like, well, if the case is that this teacher is sitting in front of their room claiming some kind of perfectionism, or these students are projecting a perfect image onto this human being, there's a power dynamic at play, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where someone's like taking the power from other individuals and maybe making rules, like you said, making rules about what enlightenment is or isn't, or what the path is or isn't. And we've talked about this as like, it may work for some people, but is really something to critically look at to see like, am I giving my power away to a system that doesn't reflect my reality, doesn't reflect my own awakening. And because we're used to giving our power to systems, because
Mm-hmm.
that's just been the tradition of cultures for many thousands of years, whether you're giving your power to your local community governments or your national governments or to your religions or all these things. There's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But there's many ways that we put our ideas of what should happen into a system and then allow the system to dictate to us what the rules, regulations, and things that we need to abide by are.
Yeah.
And we don't need to go into like all of
Yeah.
for government and politics, but when it comes to the spirit, when it comes to something that's as personal as your own connection to your own spirit, to your own sense of your spiritual journey, I think what folks are coming to is that like there is no one size fits all. There's no
Mm-hmm.
way to, because it's a personal journey. It's like
Mm.
in a sense, like although we can say at the end there's no separate person, that no one else can do it for you. Like your
And
teacher.
I've heard, sorry.
Oh no, yeah, and just because you're no one else can do it for you, um, there's a way in which it cannot be dictated to you.
Yeah. And I think, I again, I know very little, but from the conversations that I had with people who were part of a particular tradition and really dedicated, they would, for example, not explore anything else, even though like a different teaching or a different teacher, because it almost felt like a sin. It almost felt like a betray to them. And also, they believed that this was the way, like this was the correct way. You see what I mean? And so even though 20 years, I mean, some people I've spoken to, it was like 20 years of practice, okay? 20 years of dedicated practice, some glimpses, but no like shift, nothing changing. And they felt like they something had to change, but they wouldn't do anything about it because of this belief that this is the way. And then on top of that, they would feel inadequate because they feel like they fail, like they failed in following this particular path or following or achieving the whatever there are multiple attainments, I suppose. On that path. So I remember listening to those stories, and I don't know. It was just I knew that this was part of their journey and their trajectory, but there was just something so incredibly sad about that, you know. And so, yeah, I lost the plot. I don't know where I want to go with this.
Yeah, well, yeah, I might, like we've talked about this, like it might be there's some folks that follow tradition and that
Mm-hmm.
is perfectly designed for them as an
Mm-hmm.
individual
And works. Yeah.
and works, and they get wherever they desire to be, and
Mm-hmm.
they come to a place where they feel spiritually fulfilled. Um, And yeah, most folks that I've encountered, we're different in that. And I've seen many folks like you're talking about who have been in very strict traditions and have made no progress in terms
Mm-hmm.
of like their own fulfillment. I guess maybe when we talk about progress and like not needing to be as linear, it's
Mm-hmm.
almost in a sense like because because liberation just is, and it's just you know, coming to a place where we can fully like be in relationship with that liberation
Mm-hmm.
and feel that liberation with us in our lives every day. Um, it's it's almost like yeah, just being able to come into a sense of can we be fulfilled in the imperfections of our ongoing journey.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we end here? Should we end here and like leave it as a point of no, actually I seriously highly recommend sitting
Yeah.
with that one particular line that Sarah just said because it's yeah, it's just so beautiful. I don't know what to say after that, so no,
Yeah,
seriously.
to be continued. Yeah, we can chat more next week. It's a
Yeah.
very, so much, I think, for us that's unfolding, and I'm excited for our next conversation. If you want to drop comments, I know I feel like we had a lot of folks engaging on the emotions, but I'm curious. This is opening a new door of
Yeah.
something else. And
Yeah, I definitely will leave a link to actually the conversation between Dalson and Guru Viking in a description so anyone can watch it and then we'll I have a feeling we're going to chat about because I haven't watched the whole thing like I said at the start. I'm sure there's a great many other things that he mentioned in this video that Sarah and I will be happy to chat about next week. But I just have to say that just hearing this statement, I rejoiced, you know, hearing this because I truly believe this is, um, you know, it's it contributes to one of my favorite things, which is humanizing this whole enlightenment thing. And I love it so much. Whoever contributes to this in whatever way, especially if this is someone who's been revered and looked up to, and maybe even, like I said, within a certain tradition or associated with certain tradition, they come out vulnerably and honestly, I say what they want to say. Oh, I mean, to me it's just pure, it's just so beautiful. So yeah, so I'm gonna leave the link to that conversation, and we're gonna probably revisit it next week, and then join us already in the comments. If you've watched this, let us know what you thought, and then we're gonna probably continue next week unless something else comes up in the meantime that we'll decide we want to talk about. And other than that, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.